Hello, Ms. Rogers here to talk with you about Native American history and interaction with the United States government as they began to expand and made room for Americans, hence Native American removal. So we're going to start by talking about some things that you probably heard about in our last video lecture from Ms. Mitchell's, just to introduce the topic. So the initial estimates for Native American population as a whole in the Americas was somewhere between 10 and 100 million, which is a pretty big disparity. Like, is it 10 million? Is it 100 million? There's a big difference there. But even if we cut it in half, we're still talking about tens of millions of people who were here pre-Columbus. Once Columbus visits in 1492, we see with our next European interaction, the numbers were decimated, for the most part by disease, but also some purposeful killing. Some people look at this and see this as a genocide, because once we realized that disease, in fact, smallpox and other things were devastating to their population, we did use that as a weapon. And so, and even other decisions, other massacres, etc., removing, that's a polite way of putting it, but it is described all the way to genocide by some historians. So today, actually, we had a recent census, which we don't have the results for yet, but in 2006, they were initially 100% of our population, right, on this land. And in 2006, they were only 1% of the total of the United States population. So we went from 100% to 1%. Another thing that I recently became aware of was a study in 2018 in the World Psychiatry publication. They did a study on intergenerational historical trauma. And it was something that I had always believed, that trauma can be passed down, but now there's scientific evidence that that is the case. So not only looking at Native American peoples, but Holocaust survivors and their families, people, ancestors of former slaves. So populations of people can actually be born with historical trauma. So it can pass down through generations, literally at like the genetic level. It's real, it's a thing. And so we need to further understand what decisions made in our history, how they impact us today. And we'll continue to talk about decisions that are currently controversial, as well as the historical decisions of the past. So to get us started, we're going to talk about 1785. And in 1785, we had our first form of government. So we were free, we were states, and that was the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation, actually in 1787, they passed something called the Northwest Ordinance. And that's actually the most successful thing that they did as a governing body. And they measured and put into like mile cubes, a mile by a mile. Like if you think about the country block, we're pretty familiar with that in Wisconsin. If you're flying in an airplane and look down, you can see those mile by mile blocks. And they did that for purposes of ownership, so that land was equal, so that they could determine who owned what. So they went ahead and mapped and measured all this land all the way through Wisconsin to the Mississippi River. So all that land that had been gained in the French and Indian War, then when we fought our war, the American Revolution, now that land was ours. So they went ahead and mapped it all out. But in the Northwest Ordinance, I want to read to you these words: "The utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Native American lands and property, shall never be taken without consent." So those words were completely ignored going forward. They're in writing, they are by our government, promising to always respect the lands of Native Americans, and that it would not be taken without their consent. neither of those two things are followed going forward. So it was respect in theory, but not in practice. Okay, so then 1789, we ratify our Constitution, and we are, under the Constitution, same as today. 1830, this is where Native Americans began to lose all really title to their own lands. And they were removed systematically. And they turned to all three branches of our government during this same period of time. And from our legislative branch to our judicial branch to our executive branch, there was really nowhere else to turn. They didn't have any ability to defend themselves and maintain the land that they'd lived on ancestrally. So the first decision was by our legislature, Congress, and it's called the Indian Removal Act, 1830. So Indian Removal Act, at least they didn't, they didn't mince any words. They just called it what it was. We're going to remove Indians from our land, from whatever land we want. So they proceeded to do that. And they also added in the state of Georgia that white people could not be living on native lands unless they agreed to certain terms. So there was a missionary, his name was Samuel Worcester, and he refused to do the things that Georgia wanted him to do. And so he ends up taking the case. He goes to court, to the Supreme Court, and Native Americans, remember, they can't sue anybody. They have no rights to go to court. They can't testify in court. They can't bring a case to court. They have no rights at all. So Samuel Worcester is this white missionary living with the Cherokee in Georgia. Okay, so Georgia wants them to move, and Congress has paved the way. Congress, so the one branch already has said Indians are going to be removed, even though this land had already been, agreed upon that this was their land in Georgia. But gold was found on Cherokee land. So they want them out. They won't let the Cherokee mine the gold, even if they wanted to. And they don't want them in Georgia anymore. The whole state of Georgia, they want to remove the Cherokee who live there. So now it's in the hands of the Supreme Court, so the second branch of our government. And here, Chief Justice John Marshall says he agrees with the Cherokee. They get to stay. So the highest court in the land, and the ruling is that they get to stay, which is amazing, right? A win, done, case closed, they get to stay. But remember, there's another branch. And also think back, so we already said what Congress does, right? Congress passes laws, which they did, the Indian Removal Act. The Supreme Court, if you just think about the simplest thing that the Supreme Court does, they interpret laws, which they also had given them that power. So they interpret the law and they side with the Cherokee, but then remember there's a third branch that we haven't heard from yet, and that's the executive branch. And what, in the simplest of terms, does the executive do? They enforce the law. So during this Supreme Court case, we have President Andrew Jackson is the president. And what he says after the ruling by the Supreme Court by Chief Justice John Marshall, he says, let's see him enforce it. So he basically does this to the Supreme Court. They made a ruling, they're the highest court in the land, and he refuses to enforce that ruling. There's nothing the Cherokee can do. They are removed. They have no one to turn to. They have no ability to fight anybody else to remain on their own lands that they've lived on for centuries and centuries. And so at that point, they know they have to leave. There's nothing they can do. So 1834 to 1871 is a period of Native American removal. So the Western reservations, and by Western, I mean west of the Mississippi River. Okay, so Western reservations are established at that point. They are removed from their ancestral lands and thrown onto lands. And the commonality about most of the lands that they are pushed to is that they are void of water. They're desertous. most Native American tribes didn't tend to be real farming tribes, but there's no ability to farm in these places to grow food for themselves. There's no animals to hunt. The culture, the climate, everything is different, and they're just left to try to fend for themselves. And so, not ideal situation. Definitely full of trauma, and that was the situation they found themselves in. Um, the Trail of Tears happens within that, and you've probably heard of that before, but that is when they were forced to leave Georgia and walk to Oklahoma. Walk. So 18,000 Cherokee walked. That's why it's known as the Trail of Tears. And actually, if you read anything about it, they didn't cry. They refused to cry, because they didn't want to give the satisfaction to the whites around, and they carried their dead. They didn't want to leave them behind. It was horrible. 4,000 died, from the cold, from malnutrition, from some injuries, but 4,000 died on that walk out of the 18,000.
Other nations were also forced to leave their homelands under the Indian Removal Act. These included the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. In all, 46,000 Native Americans were removed from east of the Mississippi River.
The period that followed, 1864 to 1890, sort of known as the Indian Wars. So when you watch those, old westerns, cowboys and Indians, that's the period of time we're talking about here, where different tribes at different times, and sometimes uniting, would fight against the American army. And sometimes winning some of those battles, sometimes losing some of those battles, but simply trying to preserve their people, their culture. So one of the more famous ones was between, again, the Americans and the Sioux, and that was in South Dakota. So it's called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And that was the final of these battles, and it was a massacre. Initially, they called it, a battle, but when facts were shared and documents were shared, it was a massacre. And over 350 Sioux were massacred, and over half of that number were women and children. And so that was the final, again, not battle, but final event of the period known as the Indian Wars. So after that, once again, Congress, they don't want this violence. They want this to be done. And so they decide that the best thing to do is to assimilate. They believe that if they can just get the Native Americans to act like, the white Euro Anglican Americans, look like us, talk like us, dress like us, then you'll be Americans like us, and then everything will be fine. So they did a number of things. Well, first of all, it's called the Dawes Act, D-A-W-E-S, Dawes Act. And one of the things they did was started to put Native American young boys into schools, Westernized schools. And they forced them to wear, the American, European, Western style clothing. They cut their hair. And I'm sure that you've all noticed, if you're not aware or familiar, but you've noticed that most Native American men have very long hair. That is, part of their soul, their spirit. That's a sense of pride and strength, and they don't cut their hair. So when it was time to allow the children to go home, then when they were, they weren't welcomed back to their tribes. They looked different. They sounded different. They had been introduced to these new ideas that weren't part of their culture. So now, instead of assimilating into one culture, now they fit nowhere. Because the one thing they couldn't change, of course, was the color of their skin, right? So now they're not really accepted by Americans, white Americans, and they're not accepted now by their home, by their families and their friends and neighbors. So now they fit nowhere. So assimilation did not work. In addition to that, the other pieces of the Dawes Act, they said that they would divide land and give Native American adults money. They also said they couldn't negotiate those land treaties, and they couldn't vote on the laws that governed them. But even the land that was given to them individually was almost across the board taken by whites as settlers continued to push west. And they couldn't do anything about it because, once again, they can't sue. They can't fight for their land. They have no ability to do that. But keep that in mind that, again, U.S. expansion, great, sea to shining sea, manifest destiny, and the idea that we Americans believed that we were destined to take over from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but that there were people living there who had been here long before, again, European Americans had been here. And they lost a lot: lives, culture, autonomy, sovereignty. So a lot of trauma over time. All right. Thank you.